This is a complicated parak with a lot of detail. We won't go into everything, of course, but we will focus on a few hard-to-understand phrases found in the descriptions of Beit Ya'ar HaLevanon, the house of the forest of Lebanon, and the incredible wisdom Hashem had given to Shlomo HaMelech. To begin with, of course, we've already mentioned the symbolic significance of the cedars of Lebanon. From a purely technical standpoint, temples and palaces in the ancient world were complicated in that they were large structures where most trees don't provide beams that are long enough and strong enough to cover these structures. Most buildings were small and narrow, whereas these larger structures had to import cedars from Lebanon for their pillars and roofing. As such, finding lots of cedars in this structure shouldn't be all that surprising. But while it might impress some of the locals who may not have seen such structures elsewhere, would this really impress foreigners? And we're talking about all of 4 rows of pillars. Is that really enough to call it a forest of Lebanon? At first glance, it may seem a bit exaggerated. Noga Ruveni has a fascinating piece looking at this from a whole new angle. There are some terms here where we're reading the Hebrew and it's simply hard to understand. We say, ויבן את בית יער הלבנון 100 אמה אורכו, ו50 אמה רוחבו, ו30 אמה קומתו, על 4 טורי עמודי ארזים, וכרותות ארזים על העמודים. Most of the modern translations into English say that this means that there were 4 rows of cedar pillars with cedar beams upon the pillars. That means when the pasuk here says chutot, it's referring to beams. It sounds pretty standard, and it makes sense that the pillars would hold beams. But then the very next pasuk mentions these beams and calls them tzlaot. וספון בארז ממעל על הצלעות אשר לעמודים 45 הטור. So then if the tzlaot are the beams, then what are the chrutot from the previous pasuk? Some try to say that maybe they're capitals that would be placed between the top of the pillar and the ceiling or the beams above them. It makes sense, except those aren't called chrutot, those are called chotarot. Chrutot sounds more like something that's been chopped off a tree. And that's precisely how Noga explains it. The branches were chopped off the top of the trees with their needles still hanging from them and brought separately, as the rest of the logs were simply bundled together and sent down in the water along the coast. Once it arrives in Yafo, which is the port of Yerushalayim, and it's brought up to Yerushalayim itself, the pillars were used to hold the beams in the roof. But attached to the pillars were these branches which would hide the beams above and create the illusion of being under a canopy of cedar trees despite being indoors. These replaced cedar tops can last for many years as long as they're indoors and can be replaced as needed when the color begins to fade. That would be quite impressive, but it's still only 4 rows. There were 3 rows of windows, and each window faced the other window 3 times. That's the Matsuda translation in Lakewood. Not sure what that means. And there were window spaces in 3 rows, and light was against light in 3 ranks. That's the Koran translation. I don't know what either of those mean. How can a window or light face each other 3 times? Not clear to me. וכל הפתחים והמזוזות רבועים שקף, ומול מחזה אל מחזה 3 פעמים. And all the doors and posts were square with the windows, and light was against light in 3 ranks. Okay, so what does any of this mean? Here, Noga suggests that the word shakif doesn't mean window, but see-through, like the word shakuf. If so, he explains that there were 4 rows of pillars, and that includes those that are built into the walls themselves. And then that means that there was 3 open spaces between the 4 sets of pillars. So in essence, you're left with 3 passages between each row of pillars. If that's the case, then visitors would walk in between the rows of cedar tree-looking pillars. The word mecheza, which they translate as either windows, again, despite it being a different word within the same pasuk, or as light, though it makes it very hard to understand how light can be facing light, Noga says it means mirrors. They did have mirrors back then, as we know from the kior being made of mirrors. Though this term isn't found anywhere else in Tanakh, mecheza is like chozeh, to see, just as mara is like ro'eh, to see. So it makes sense. The mirrors wouldn't have been made of glass, but of polished copper, and it would have been along the walls, which reflects back the cedars in front of them, creating an illusion of an endless forest of cedars in all directions, along the sides and even in the front and back next to the square doorways. If this is correct, you would walk on the shakef, or open paths between the pillars of cedar trees that were adorned on top with the rutot, the tree canopy-like branches, as if you're under the real trees themselves. And it seemed to stretch on and on forever in every direction because of the mechazah, the mirrors reflecting the trees on and on into an indoor, never-ending cedar forest. This is quite an incredible sight to imagine. If all of that isn't enough, the place is adorned with golden shields, not meant, of course, for battle, as it would be heavy, expensive, and not really strong enough, but simply for decor and showing the impressive strength and wealth of the kingdom. All of this was done for the glory of Hashem, and it really did make quite an impression on foreign dignitaries who would arrive from afar. But it can also begin to foreshadow certain issues that will arise. The back and forth between the building of Shlomo's palace and the Beis Hamikdash can make it hard to decipher exactly where the line is drawn between them. This can be seen as an issue. Shlomo saw his own palaces as just as important as the Beis Hamikdash. Or it can be seen as a profound statement. The job of the king is meant to be like the service of Hashem in the Beis Hamikdash itself, connecting the people with Hashem, not Khalilah distancing them. Shlomo built the Beit Hamikdash for 7 years, and his own palace 13. These are two psukim right next to each other. Is it hinting that he put more work into his own palace than into the Beis Hamikdash? Or could it mean that he built the Beis Hamikdash with greater zrizos, and that his own palace wasn't as important, so he didn't take the work as quickly? There's such a fine line between vastly different intentions, and sometimes in our own lives, we can convince ourselves that we're doing the right thing for the right reasons and explain things away. In the end of the day, though, what was really our intention deep down? Here, the goal was to serve Hashem, both through the Beis Hamikdash and through showing the world how successful we were. Seems great, but in order for this to happen, certain rules had to be bent here and there. The incredible amount of horses brought in from Mitzrayim, the extra wives who brought in foreign influence, the mass amounts of gold that made silver worthless. We can't help but remember Devarim Yud Zayin regarding the laws of the Jewish king and what he should look like. רק לא ירבה סוסים, ולא ישיב את העם מצרימה למען הרבות סוסים. והשם אמר לכם, לא תוסיפון לשוב בדרך הזה עוד. He shouldn't amass horses, which will cause him to seek them out in Mitzrayim, becoming dependent on Mitzrayim again. ולא ירבה נשים, ולא יצור לבבו. וכסף וזהב לא ירבה מאוד. That he shouldn't marry lots of women, not necessarily because more than one wife just never seems to end well in Tanakh, which is also true, but perhaps this is referring to specifically to a large amount of political marriages, which will bring foreign influences, as it explains explicitly in the pasuk. Otherwise, they'll turn his heart away from serving Hashem. And he shouldn't amass too much gold and silver. Instead, he should always have a Torah and continue to learn from it. Otherwise, he'll end up just like the cedar tree in a place unfitting of it, ill-placed pride and distanced from Hashem.